Okay, my friends. So we were talking about the rise of the cities and trade between cities and trade between regions, between Mesopotamia and Eastern Mediterranean, Mesopotamia and yeah, of course Syria and Lebanon, Mesopotamia and Anatolia, Mesopotamia and Central and even East Asia, right? So we talked about the ancient trade routes, right? And we talked about the populations that dwelled in the cities and those who specialized in crafts and whatnot, right? And those who were bureaucrats and priests and different echelons of the society, right? So, but then one of the important things that we have already talked about and we need to further discuss is another civilization or kind of element, right? And that is the whole notion of writing, right? The beginning of writing, right? And we have talked about this, that it began, writing actually began in Sumer, right? And it is what distinguishes your history from your prehistory, right? Ostensibly, right? So anyway, we have the archaeological evidence that puts the beginning of writing, right, in 5000 BCE, right? But how, right? The question is how, right? By 2800 BCE, a sophisticated writing system of cuneiform. Cuneiform actually, my friends, means edge, cunei, and form, edge form, right? Edge formed, right? Cuneiform. And we will see why it had, it had to be kind of edge formed, right? And we have discussed this a little bit, right? And by the fact that they had the reeds, right? They made their writing instrument from the reeds, and the reeds were sort of, I'm sorry, wedge shaped, right? Wedge shaped, right? And therefore the kind of writings that you could make were strokes, right? Strokes in forms that look like nails, and we will see how that works out. But anyway, by 2500 BCE, you had you had already scribal schools developed, and we will see that the writing, the cuneiform writing, was extremely hard to learn and to master. So these scriber schools and people who could afford to go to scribal schools, people who could afford to get an education, right, and to get a good education, right, as you are, right, hopefully in your all of your classes, right, I'm sure in my class, right, okay. Well, anyway, so it was a very very it was yeah. I mean, learning takes time, right? You have to put the effort, right, in order to open these beautiful minds, right? So okay, you started the scribal schools and you began training students with knowledge, right? And it was not just writing, right? You had to study, mathematics, as we talked about it. You needed geometry. You had worked out already your astronomy, and we're going to talk about these a little bit more, right? And you can read about them, and you have your videos, right, my friends? So, the technology of it, however, right? I mean, we talk about writing, and we think, well, how did it develop, right? How did it develop? Well, we talked about the trade, right? The trade routes, right? If you wanted to do trade, right, between your cities, right, or between your regions, right, you needed a system of accounting, right? You needed to know, right, for your own purposes, what you're sending, right? And you made a sort of note of that. And the person who was on the receiving aid, the party who was on the receiving aid, when they received their sort of goods, right? They would know how many of, say, for instance, how many measures of barley is Mesopotamia sending, right, to to uh, to to uh, to Syria and Lebanon, right, in order to get their cedar trees, right, or how many cedar trees, right? But this all needed some form of accounting, right? So what you developed, right, the way writing developed, right, was through a system of tokens, right? Where you had balls of clay, right, as you have here, right? And then with wedge shaped writing, with cuneiform writing, you made a note about what is in there. This is the second millennium BCE. Already the writing has developed, but if we go earlier, right, for instance, this one of Susa, or this one again, this Susa in Iran, remember, and this one again from Susa, right? You will see that it began with you began by having these balls, right? That was somehow attached to your goods, right? And inside the balls, right? You had sort of tokens, right? Various shaped tokens that represented um, different goods that you're sending them, right? That is how it developed. Then you began to see, to think, okay, um, you know um, so here, for instance, also you have images, right, of some form of animals, right, that you're probably bartering, right? So on the back on the sort of face of the ball, on the surface of the ball, you draw these pictures, right? And then gradually you realize, right, that you don't need the balls, right, and you don't need the tokens inside of it, really, right? All you can do, right, is draw, right, the representations of of the representations of the sort of material, right? And I'm wondering whether this is an oh yes, this is a yes, this is one of the ones that I wanted to show you. As you can see, as you can see in the bottom um of the of this kind of a ball, right? The Blau monuments. it is combines proto-cuneiform, right? Proto-cuneiform, which you see, yeah, you can kind of identify sort of by the wedge-shaped writings here and there, right? Um, and proto-cuneiform characters and illustrations, right, of early Sumerians, right? So this is the proto-cuneiform sort of um, stage of the development um, of the of writing, right? Um, and we talked about how because reed were made, yeah, a reed. Remember we talked about reeds and the importance of reeds. Reeds were wedge shaped, right? So you needed to do your writing, so to speak, in strokes and wedges, which comes to be known cuneiform, Latin for wedge-shaped, right? And that the mastering of it was extremely hard, right? So here, yeah, this is again early cuneiform, the Kish tablet, right? One of the cities of Mesopotamia. Lo and behold, where is it being held? Right in the Ashmolean Museum, right? So, so you see that this is sort of it's a combination of well, I mean, it's a pictographic, right, depiction of sort of what is being traded and whatnot, right? Um, so again, here you have a proto-cuneiform tablet, right? Well, I could figure out one dog here, right? It, seal impression, administrative account of barley distribution with cylinder seal, right, on which you have a proto-cuneiform written, right, and you have male figures, which I mean, I tried to look for it, you guys, right, but I couldn't. So if any one of you can identify it and tell me where it is, right, that's extra credit for you. Just write to me, email me. Okay, so there's the male figure somehow somewhere. A hunting dog, I think it's this one, and the boar I couldn't find, but the barley we can see as well here as well, right? So that is how your system of writing developed, right? For accounting purposes, for the purposes of record keeping, right? You developed the first system, right? The first writing system, right? You began actually to write down, right? Thoughts, right? You began to write down, as we will see, laws. You began to write down poetry. You began to write down epics, right? Astronomical tables, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, you began to do sciences, right? Well, of course, calculations and mathematics and engineering and all of that, right? All of that, right, needs some sort of, also record keeping and administrative duties and whatnot. So, the fact that you're taking notes, hopefully, right now, my friends, and you're writing down stuff, right? Yeah. Uh, that we have it, right, from the age of Sumerians, right? 5,000 years ago, right? It is not that far ago, considering uh, our human history and whatnot, yes. you know, nevertheless, compared to our lives and to our contemporary history, is far long time ago, right? Okay, so these were the Sumerians, and we're going to talk about their social classes. I think we have talked about social classes enough, right? And so the Sumerians, the achievements of the Sumerians, right? The development of the wheel, the development of the plow, the development of writing, the creation of cities, intensive agriculture, monumental buildings, right, and temples, and the various strata of society that needed, right, uh, that were needed in order to satisfy the needs of the society at the time. The needs of the society at the time were basically the same needs as us, right? I mean, you basically there you accumulate wealth, right? And you need to be fed and so on and so forth. You need arts and architecture, and you need beauty in your worlds, and you need sciences, and so on and so forth. Everything that we needed, yeah, they needed, except that during the past 300 years, we got into this industrial age, right? And ostensibly, our world, well, not ostensibly for reality, right? Our world changed, yeah? I don't need to tell you in how. But anyway, all the elements of civilization that we have today already came into being around 5 to 3,000 years ago through the Sumerians, who spoke an isolate language, right, and so on and so forth. But gradually, right, gradually, if we go back to our well, to well, you let me see, my friends. Is there a way ever to go to the beginning of this? Chronology. I am so sorry. Okay, here's our chronology, right? So you see that your early dynastic period, right, is basically the Sumerian period, is something like from 3000. I mean, of course, you have. You remember you had before Sumer, you already had your Obeid and Uruk periods. Remember, right? Yeah, that we're going. Yeah, but anyway, the dynastic period of Sumer, right, begins in 3000 BCE and goes to 2350 years BCE, right? I mean, 650 years, right, basically, yeah? But then a new population emerges, right, in Mesopotamia, right? I mean, at one point we had the notion of mass migration of the Semitic population, right? And now we're more and more talking about the fact that they were probably living in the vicinity of the area. So there comes the Akkadian sort of period of Sumerian history, right, where a new population comes actually to the fore, i.e., they begin to have taking over the power, right? One of the most important sort of figures of the Akkadians was the the king Sargon of Akkad. We will talk about him right in a second. Sargon of Akkad, who sort of began to bring together, right, all the different achievements of these city states, right, and in fact created what was up to that point, right, not a political entity before, right? In other words, you had city states before, but what Sargon did, right, Sargon of Akkad, right, did was to actually bring some of the more important city states together under his own rule, right? So he collected the resources of all these cities, right, under his own rule. And please bear with me as I take us again to where we were before, right? And here you see enter the Semitic population, right, in Sumeria. Now the Semitic population is Sumeria, right? Sumerian was a different language, right? The language of the Akkadians was Semitic, right? Not connected to Sumerian. So what did they? What people who kind of needed at the top echelons, right? Those people between these populations who were in a position to need to talk to the other, right? Yeah, a Sumerian to an Akkadian, right? They wanted to talk to each other. To begin with, therefore, you become bilingual, right? You become bilingual. Once you become bilingual, right? Well, and in order to become more bilingual, others becoming more bilingual, you have the beginnings of Sumerian Akkadian dictionaries. So when you look up some word on the internet and you Google it, my friends, right? These guys didn't have Googling, right? But they did have the dictionaries to take care of the job, right? And so you have populations who become bilingual as a result. But when you carry words from one language to another language, right? It is sometimes you can see, if you have a second language, it's hard to translate one word into the other into the other word, right? Why is it so hard? Because there's a cultural context, right, to what you're saying, right? If in among the tribes of ancient tribes of Saudi Arabia, right, you have I don't know, close to say 40 words, right, for all kinds of heat or whatnot. I'm just giving an example, right? But you don't have a word for snow, right? So we already know that you're coming from an arid zone, right? Whereas I'm coming from for instance, right? I'm coming from an arid zone, and you're coming from a zone that is cold and icy and so forth and so forth. So there is cultural borrowing that takes place, right, between the Semitic populations of and the Akkadians, right, and there are plenty of beauties to go around in each culture, right? So there are, yeah, obviously intermarriages, right, between the two groups, right? And then later on, we see that there comes the Elamite, the Kassites, and as I just briefly mentioned to you, to the east of Mesopotamia was the equally old. Uh, Sort of culture of Elamites, right? Very sophisticated culture of Elamite, and to their east, right? So they were another population group, and that that we're in contact, right, with both the Semites as well as the Sumerian population of Mesopotamia. So the Sumerians, the Akkadians enter, right, and you see from here you see Sumer, right, dynasty of Sumer itself, 3200, 2800, dynasty of Kish, right, and Kish we remember was here, right, and dynasty of Ur, right, dynasty of Ur, and the dynasty of Lagash, right, the early dynastic period, right, of Sumer. Then comes the campaigns of Sargon the First. And what did Sargon the First do? Right, Sargon the Great. Right, what did he do? Well, remember we talked about the resources, right, of say Eastern Mediterranean, of Anatolia, right, of eastwards to heartland of Elam, and so on and so forth, right? And we said one of the ways to to like get these resources that you don't have, right, in Mesopotamia, right, is to trade, right? We talked about that, right? But another way of doing it, of course, as we talked about it again, is to conquer, right? So that is exactly what Sargon did. And how did his conquests go towards the Fertile Crescent? So the Akkadians are important in the history of Mesopotamia in that they created sort of the first mini empire, right, of Mesopotamia, sort of, connecting at least half of the Fertile Crescent together, right, my friends, and creating the first empire in the region, right? And one thing that I want you to keep in mind is that here we are in Egypt to our west. We are dealing with also the early dynastic period of Egypt, which we'll get to. Well, actually, yeah, early dynastic, right? But dynastic period of Egypt, and then the Old Kingdom period of Egypt that goes, both of them together go from, circa 3000 BCE, right? Basically, yeah. And the Old Kingdom, as we will see, finishes 2052, right? Um, and uh, and this is after the Akkadian Empire, and we will see how the chronology goes again later on, right? So we talked about the Semitic populations, right, and we know what Semitic refers to and what languages belong to it by now, right, my beautiful friends, yeah. So we know that they probably, some of them were nomads, right? But others probably were already semi-settled, right, close to Mesopotamia, but by 2000, right, they had become politically dominant, right? And they established the city states of the Akkadian Empire, right? It's the first time that we're talking about an empire, right? And specifically, the one of the first kings of the empire, the Sargon of Akkad, yeah, who, you know, the few city states had become powerful, and that had become powerful, Sargon was able to unite these, right? And he titled himself actually, Sumer and Akkad, two of the more important cities at the time, right? Regions, and the Akkadians basically ruled for not that long, 120 years, right? This is a sort of artistic rendering of Sargon of Akkad. We have it actually in our museums. Incidentally, Metropolitan Museum is opening up again, and I usually used to give assignments to go to the museum, but I don't want to do that now. But for your information, I'm just telling you in case. Okay, so here you are, my friends, right? I mean, you please don't lose sight of Elam, although on the Iranian plateau, they are also a population where about that are Elamite is actually also a isolate language, right, my friends, and a sophisticated, urban civilization. Okay, but of course we won't have. Maybe we will have time to go over it. But anyway, this is the empire of one of the one of the Akkadian kings, right? Okay, so this is how the Akkadian Empire began to look like, right, under Sargon, right, and began sort of expanding itself in various sort of sections, regions, right? Okay, my friends. So after the Akkadians, once again, right? Once again, we revert back to the Sumerian dynasty of the third dynasty of Ur, right? Also, not for long, right? For basically a century, right? But for whatever reasons, the Akkadian state fell, right, around 2030, right? We don't know, but what we do know is that the unification of empire under Sargon meant that you had created sort of, but first of all, you had created a more expanding bureaucracy. You're centralizing basically your empire. You are creating the conditions in an empire, right, of exchange of ideas, right, between various population groups, right? So once you create an empire, right, you begin to use the resources of all the populations under your control, right, in order to rule that empire, right? And once that falls, right, nevertheless, the infrastructure that you had created, the conditions that you had created, the history that you had created, right, would not go away, right? So therefore, yeah, the third dynasty of Ur, the Sumerian dynasty that comes after the Akkadians, they nevertheless had tighter they had, not nevertheless, they came to have tighter government control, expanding bureaucracy, obsessive record keeping, right? And in this case, the city of Ur became dominant, right? Not Sumer and Akkad, but the city of Ur, creating the third Ur dynasty, right? Third Ur, let's say, empire, right? And you see that there are other people sort of standing by. The Amorites. The Amorites are also Semitic population, right? That come after the first, so quote unquote, wave, yeah, so to speak, yeah. And there we have your third Ur empire, Ur 3 empire, or third Ur empire for you, right? So what do you have in the third Ur empire already? Yeah, you have connected cities, you need roads, right? You need roads. You want to travel these roads, right? So you have to have them well maintained, right? Why do you, besides trade and whatnot, what do you want? You want to correspond with your neighboring cities, right? So you have messengers, you communicate with others, right? You have by now an official calendar, right, based on the system of 60, as I told you, right? And you have you have your months and standards, weights and measures, right? Uniform writing practices, improve your central administration, of course, right? And you also create walls, right? And you have so much resources, right, that your king can erect a wall of 125 miles, right? I don't know what is the distance between New York and Philadelphia, my friends, right? But something close to that. Something, I don't know, but something close to that, right? I mean, it takes too long. Otherwise, we could go to the map, and you could go to the map and figure it out, right? So by the time the Semitic Amorites come in, right? Imagine, I mean, you have created this empire, right? Already, I mean, you created. I mean, now forget about the empire. Talk about the villages that you started from, right? You needed someone, right, to arbiter, right, issues for you, right, between you. You needed to run a community, and you needed to have, not the law and order of the kind of Monsieur Trump, right? But you nevertheless needed to have law and order. And imagine how this law might have developed once your community became socially differentiated. Once you begin to have cities, once you have begin to have trade, right? What do you need? You need a system of laws, right? Of course. And here come your Amorites, right? Your Semitic Amorites, right? And what do they do, right? The Amorites that are ruling, right, between 1900 and 1600, right? One of their kings, right, towards a long reign, right, almost half a century, right? King Hammurabi, right? King Hammurabi writes a law code, right? A law code of Hammurabi, right? And we will talk about the code of Hammurabi, yeah. But it was inscribed on a polished black stone, right? and provided judges with a lengthy set of examples illustrating principles to be used in different cases. For each case, a law, right? Some an example called for severe physical punishment. Lo and behold, an eye for an eye, right? Um, so their system of justice, yeah, was different from the monetary penalties that Ur's society, for instance, applied, right? Um, okay, I want you to read the Code of Hammurabi, my friends, right? I have sort of provided the text for you. I want you to read it, right? And at some point, we will have a discussion of it. I will provide for you a discussion of it before we would get to your quiz for this module, right? But so one of the things that I want you to do, I want you to read the Code of Hammurabi. I want you to figure out what different classes, social classes there are, right? I want you to figure out the nature of their laws. I'm sorry, nature of their laws, right? It is the connection between laws and lies of the current administration, right, and the Justice Department and whatnot that is confusing me, my friends. Okay, so I want you to figure out, right, the various social classes, right? I mean, we talked about, we briefly mentioned the fact that temple leaders and the kings, I mean, we didn't briefly mention it, we saw it, right? And gods, right? Temples and you had lands assigned to kings and temple leaders, and they had agricultural estates, right? But it was the palace administration that collected the taxes. Yeah, very very important. Yeah, the taxes. I mean, these monumental projects have to be sort of supported somehow, right? I mean, it is not Trump's wall we are talking about, right? Yeah, I mean, even if you had built it, right, it would have required a lot of resources, right? He wanted to get it from what I forget now, from the Mexicans, right? And and they said, no siree, right? And he couldn't muster the funds finally, and it didn't happen, right? But 120 miles of walls had already been created in Mesopotamian. Long walls had already been created in had already been created in Mesopotamia. So the social divisions, right? I want you to see what is the social class divisions of 18th century Amorite society, right? Where remember Amorites and Hammurabi's name, Hammurabi, right? Hammurabi, the same root, right? And three different classes, right? The free landowning classes, royalty, high-ranking officials, warriors, priests, and merchants, and sometimes artisans and shopkeepers, right? The class of dependent farmers and artisans, right? Remember your pyramid, the king, right? The elite, right? Free elite, and the free class of farmers, right? Farmers, artisans, those attached to, excuse me, temples, and finally slaves, which are nevertheless primarily employed in, please note, in domestic services, right? Part of the family, they become part of the family, right? So the lower orders received the more severe punishment. So you see, justice was unequally distributed, as it is today, right? Uh, as it has been always, even through our modernist, presentist societies, right? So the slaves were no were sort of, oh, sorry, my friends, I don't know what happened here. Okay. Different marks, telltale marks of slaves from freed people. Yeah. Um, okay. Um, Distinctive hairstyles for the slaves, right? So I want you to read the Code of Hammurabi, my friends, and pay attention to the social classes, to the nature of their justice, to what is familiar and what is unfamiliar, right? To us, 21st century men and women, from a code that was written in 18th century BCE. I want you to point out those similarities as well, right? And women in Mesopotamia, I please read it from your uh, uh, from your texts, right? Um, and now I'm going to show you a number of specimen of all the things that we have talked about, right? Here you have scribes, right? Elite part of society, using their reed styly, right? And to write. There are other uses of the reed. Remember the man create, using it for creating mats, clothing, housing, right, and so on and so forth. In the tablet house, right, which is attached to the temple or palace, is where students learn writing and mathematics. Yeah, unfortunately, therefore, you realize that you basically had to be from upper social classes, right, to be able uh, to to get a good education, right? Um, so when in the old Babylonian period, right, which comes even after the Amorites come in, right? I mean, in the around that time, right? Um, you see that the growth of private commerce, yeah, brought an increase in the people who could read and write, right? Um, but literacy, as I told you, a rare accomplishment, right? Um, okay, uh, okay. So amongst the achievements, right? Remember the wheel that I told you, but the wheel that is here, the wheel of the chariot, the wheel actually began its life as the wheel of making pottery, right? And then it develops into the wheel and the chariot, right? Which was an important innovation, my friends. It is this elementary concept that you need to have, right? That comes to you from by the grace of Sumerians and whatnot in ancient period, right? That you can drive your cars today, and then you had artwork, right? And so where did you get you get your gold from Egypt, as we will see, right? You get your excuse me, lapis lazuli, right, from Central Asia, from current day Afghanistan, right? Of course, they are precious commodities, right? So they're expensive, right? So there you produce art, but you produce this kind of art for obviously for the elite of your society, for the upper echelons of your society, right? Women. Textile became an important sort of source of good production, right? For the Mesopotamians, and women, of course, were the chief sort of artisans, right? In creating the in creating the in weaving the cloth, right? So, and then you had you had another important innovation we talked about, right? Sumerian plow, right? And to which you had an animal, a, a cow. This is my definition of a cow, you guys. Okay, sort of attached, right? In order to better sort of cultivate your land, right? So the Code of Hammurabi, right, first code of law, the principle of justice that outlasted any one ruler, i.e., this became the law of the land, right? Yeah, and it was in the 18th century, different penalties for different social classes, right? But it addressed all social classes. Even slaves had some rights under Hammurabi's law, right? This is part of the stele of law code of Hammurabi, right? And where is it? Lo and behold, in the Louvre, right? In the Louvre Museum in Paris, and here is its law code. Of course, written in what language? In what script? In cuneiform. So we've basically covered, my friends, all the matters that we are indebted to, right? To this society, right? In the land between two rivers are the wheels, right? The sailboat, the wheel, the writing system, irrigation, right? Urbanization, the first maps, right? The first mathematics, time and clocks, astronomy and astrology, and finally medicine and drugs. And this, my friend, will be the timeline, the general timeline of Mesopotamia that we will discuss, right? I am letting you go in this session, right, around this period with the Amorites, right? Amorites and the Code of Hammurabi. No, Hammurabi. Pretend this is Hammurabi, my friends, okay? I love you. Until next session, prosper. Prosper and stay healthy and wise. Bye.